Welcome along to Obsession Engineering. That is an RS660 engine and it is broken. And so we're going to take it apart and have a look and see what inside has gone wrong. One thing we know that is definitely broken is the crankcase, because there is a big crack across the front of here. And so that tells me the issue is definitely bottom end related, between that and the fact that it locked up and sent our rider into the gravel. And so I think what we ought to do is just start taking it apart, and as I'm doing that, I'll just chat to you and tell you what I'm finding and how I'm doing things. Right, better crack open the toolbox. Because I believe the top end of the engine is okay, I'm going to take that off early because that will make everything on the bench a little bit easier. And so first job will be coils out, rocker cover off, and then I can't actually turn the crank around to get the cams in the right position, so I'm just going to be very careful undoing the cam carrier and then taking the cams out, then taking the head off. Sounds simple enough, doesn't it? Good. Let's crack on then. So while I'm doing this, I'm going to make a very specific point. I am not at any point in this, well, not expecting to, be blaming Aprilia for anything that's gone wrong with this. We've obviously raced these engines in Super Twin spec at TT, which is pretty much the ultimate test for engine longevity, and issues have been very limited. We have had a couple of niggles. The early one was an oil pressure relief valve that came undone, but Aprilia have since fixed that, and any issue we've had after that has been down to excessive mileage on tuned engines, frankly. So these engines are generally pretty sturdy nowadays. Right, rocker cover off. Next job is cams out. I am going to speed this process up in places by cracking open the impact gun, which I wouldn't normally do when I'm taking engines apart. But being as quite a lot of this is already broken, I'm not particularly worried about breaking it anymore. But because I want to take the cams out quite gently, because the head is still good, I'm going to do this by hand. Just out of shot behind here, there is a selection of containers for putting engine parts in, so that I can separate cylinder head stuff from clutch stuff from bottom end sort of crankcase stuff. And if you're putting an engine back together, that makes life a lot easier, because you know the screws and bolts and bits that from your cylinder head aren't mixed up with the ones from your crankcases, and it just simplifies the job a little bit. It keeps it nice and organised. So because normally you would put the crank in a specific position to then take the cams out of it when there's minimal load on the pushing on the cam carrier, but this engine is pretty solid at the bottom end, so I can't actually turn it over very easily. And so what I'm doing is just undoing the cam carrier bit by bit, and you can see there the spring load from the valve springs is actually pushing the cam carrier up, and I need to do it bit by bit, side to side, because if I do it all in one place in one go, it can try and tilt the cam carrier, and actually it can break it because the springs are quite strong when you're down to your last couple of bolts. So stage by stage we shall just lift this up. Right, cam cover off, cam carrier, which the cam's running. Pop that in with my rocker cover. Then we can hook the camshaft out, and worth having a bit of a look. No damage or wear on the nose, on the lobes or anything on that one. Get the exhaust one out. Again, just going to have a look, make sure there's no damage on the lobes on the journals, but it's looking good. And that means the next job is to actually get the rest of the cylinder head off. Rearrange that a bit. So to get the cylinder head off, there's two little M6 screws which are 8mm headed, but they're quite a long way down there, so we'll just take them off early. And then there are 6 relatively big nuts, 13mm headed. I think they're M8, probably 10 studs that hold everything together. So I'll need to undo those, but that means I'm going to need a big bar because they're in their elastic range of their tension. They're tensioned into their elastic range of the bolt. That's what I was trying to get to. But before I can actually get to those, I need to take that little cover off because the thermostat cover actually stops you getting to one of the bolts properly. And it's always best to do cylinder head bolts and crankcase bolts and bits in a sort of diagonal system, so it takes the load off the components relatively evenly, and it stops the metals, the surfaces distorting as you're undoing them, which means your mating faces for your head gasket and bits stay in better flatness. That is all the nuts and washers off the cylinder head. So, with a little bit of a wiggle, that will now come off the head gasket, and we can bit by bit slide that up the studs. Camtain tensioners are only getting in the way a little bit, and I forgot to undo that water pipe. That's annoying. Now that I've actually removed the water pipes, which I really should have done first, we can whip that head off, and there's a little bit of sort of aluminium deposit, a bit of marking on number 1 where the piston has hit it, which isn't ideal, which means at some point we need to take the valves out of this and see if it's bent the valves, because it might, if it's hit the head, it might just tweak the valves a little bit. But they don't appear obviously bent, so the chances are the guides and bits are probably okay, but at some point that will need a little bit of extra investigation. If we have a look at the pistons, this one has no damage. Interesting sort of carbon build-up only just there, so quite why it does that is a mystery to me, but it has done. But this cylinder, you can actually see like an indentation, a witness mark actually pushed into the piston round the edge here, and a ridge just here, which actually shows it's been hitting the cylinder head that hard, it's actually shaped the piston. And so obviously when that's hit the piston, whether it's done it once or several times, I suspect just once, that's actually hit the piston really hard, which gives us an indication of the force involved, that cast piston has actually been sort of flattened out by the cylinder head. So there's obviously a lot of force happened with what's gone on down here, and it's enough force to break the crankcase. And so I think the next thing to do then is take the clutch off it, take the alternator cover off the other side, take the sump off, and then split the crankcases and see what chaos has ensued inside. And to speed the job up, I'm going to rattle the screws off with an impact gun. And then if I tweak the actual clutch actuator arm, that breaks the seal onto the clutch cover. And clutch cover off. The good news is the seal is still intact in the clutch cover, because if the crank snaps, which may have been what's happened here, if the end of the crank that actually acts as part of the breather system does sort of flaps around in this cover, it writes the cover off. Anything we can salvage from this engine is of course money in the bank, so we want to get as much out of this as possible. Right, clutch, 3 10mm headed M6 screws hold the clutch pack in, and the very long screws. So again, faster with the impact gun. To get the big clutch nut undone in the middle of the clutch, there is a locking tab which I've released, and then I'm literally going to use my thumb, push that against the stack of clutch plates that are still in, and that should hold enough tension on the clutch that the impact gun can actually rattle the main clutch nut undone. Or at least that's the idea. And this is the joys of electric impact guns. More go than a pneumatic one, and quieter. So here we go. And there we go, clutch nut undone. Then with the big main clutch nut undone, I can literally just pull the clutch hub out with the plates and everything stacked on it. Makes removing that very easy, and also means all my clutch plates are in the right order. Don't forget the washer that sits behind it. And then I should literally just be able to pull the clutch basket out. Just pop that in there and we'll put it all in a pile of clutch bits. And now, just spinning the gearbox by hand, and the gearbox spins. It is still in gear, no it's not, it's in neutral. There we go, we can spin the gearbox by hand, which means it doesn't appear the gearbox is locked up in it. That's one thing then, out the way. So, turn that round, take the alternator cover off. First job on the alternator cover side is to take the R&G crash protector off, because that has done its job and we have no damage on our actual engine cover. With the R&G engine protector off, I'm going to take the water pump cover off first, because some of the screws from that actually hold the alternator cover on as well. But if I take that off first, any water will just dribble out onto the bit of cloth I've put down here. And it means I've not got bolts that are trying to undo two surfaces at once on any longer than I need to. There's the water we talked about. And then just like I did with the clutch cover side, I'm just going to go round it and buzz all the bolts out. Right, alternator cover off. And the first thing I found in here is bits of metal. So we have bits of metal down there. Now the actual windings don't appear to be damaged, and the cover doesn't appear to be damaged, but there is quite a lot of bits of metal down here. So I'm guessing they're bits of crankshaft and crankcase. But that cover, at first instances, looks serviceable, so we'll put that in the pile of things to be, hopefully, of value to us later. So under this piece of broken engine here is the balance shaft. It lives in there, and if we look down here, this wheel, this gear, isn't lined up with everything else, and that is the drive for the balance shaft. So that tells me we've had a balance shaft snap. Whether anything else has snapped inside as well is yet unknown, but I can tell you for now, that is definitely not meant to be pointing at that slightly weird angle. So the next thing I need to do is rotate the engine back on the bench a little bit, take the sump off it, which I assume will also be full of bits of metal, and then we can get towards actually getting the crankcases open. So, similar procedure taking the side covers off. Just rattle the bolts out with the impact gun. Something interesting is happening inside here, because as I undid the bolts I heard something tinkle inside, which is generally a bad sign. And there's some very bad things in here. Conrod bolt snapped in half. A piece of metal which I'm saying is probably a very flattened out crank bearing, like a big end or a main bearing shell. A second rod bolt, and something that appears like a gear, but I actually don't think it is. If you look at it, it's very thin. So that isn't a gear. What I think that is another bottom end shell that's then been fired presumably through the gearbox to give it that shape. And I assume that is probably what locked the bike up, because it doesn't matter if your slipper clutch activates at that point. If the gearbox is locked solid because there's a piece of big end shell in it, it's night-night. Yes, random bits of aluminium. Yes, the sump itself is perfectly good. The things inside it definitely aren't. There's a little plastic moulding on this oil strainer. That's very important, because on the early bikes, the first 2 years-ish, they didn't have this, and that stops the oil pressure relief valve, which is just here, unscrewing itself and falling into the sump, which is, on the early engines, a bit of a known issue. And so if you have an early engine, it is very, very, very worthwhile taking the sump off, taking the oil pressure relief valve out, and actually basically you have to drill through the little shroud that's over it and lock wire it in place, because it could well save you an engine replacement. But of course Aprilia have fixed that now for the newer ones, so you don't have to worry about it. With the sump off, it's a really easy time to turn the engine over and look at some of the chaos, and there is some definite chaos in here, because that is half a conrod, and it should be hugging around that crank pin down there, but it isn't. What we do know is it's come down here and smashed the crankcase down here, I can see a big dent in the top of the crankcase down there, and then I'm pretty confident it will have gone forwards as well and hit the balance shaft, which is probably what's made that go wrong. And so what we need to do next is split the crankcases. And to do that, I need to undo all of the bolts, which are all around here, all the main bearing bolts, take that big cap out because there's a bolt under there, some little ones down there. And once we've got all that apart, we can actually split the cases and see what's really happened inside there. And probably more importantly, see what's actually salvageable. Now that was interesting, because as I undid the last bolt that holds the engine together, the crankcase actually sprung apart, which I've never known happen before. So that tells me there was still some energy sort of locked into the engine. And I can't actually get some of these bolts out, so yes. The amount of stress this thing's gone through is pretty spectacular. And now with all the crankcase bolts undone and a little bit of room made on the bench down here, it's time to take the cases apart. And because again I don't care so much about this set, we can give them a little tap. And to be fair, engine cases, they don't mind a little love kiss sometimes. So that didn't take a lot of taking apart. Let's see what other dramas we've. You know, I said I thought the balance shaft was bent. Look at that. And that is a pretty sturdy lump of metal. So imagine the energy that's had to go into bending that like that. Wow. That is pretty spectacular. So I've got one more thing to undo, and it's the con rod that's still attached to the other cylinder. And then we can take the crank out of it, I can take some of the gearbox out of it, and we can have a proper look inside and see how catastrophic this damage is. Although if I'm honest, I can probably tell you it's about knackered. So to get better access to one of the rod bolts, I shall just pop half the gearbox out, just tight on its seal at that end. Again, we'll just give it a tap with the soft end of the hammer, and I'll just have a little look at it before we go too crazy. And I can't see anything really obvious with this. There's no teeth missing. There doesn't appear to have been an impact on it. So I am still dubious that a big end shell has gone through it somewhere, but I can't actually see where. So it might have actually been through the primary drive or somewhere instead. So at some point I will put these in a good set of cases, spin them around and make sure the actual shafts aren't bent. But so far it looks like we might have got a gearbox out of this. And now I have slightly easier access into the rod bolts, which means I should be able to wiggle the crankshaft out of it. And the crank does have some witness marks on it where the rod's been hitting it, so the crank is no good. But that's not a great surprise really, considering the damage to everything else. And I think now what we'll do is get a punch and get rid of that piston. There you go. A piston on half a con rod, which tells a story. But of course the question is, did the rod bolt fail and the rod go at an odd angle and something hit it and that makes the rod fail, or did the rod snap in half first and then everything else follows? I'm more inclined to think that the rod bolt failed, or something in the bottom end of the rod let go, because if this had snapped, you'd end up with a lot less load on the bottom end of the rod, and then there'd be no reason for the bolts to come undone. So I think it's actually a rod bolt issue that's caused this, not specifically a rod. So let's have a slightly closer look at some of the details of this. That is the crack in the crankcase that you can see from the front, but look at the distortion in this area around the actual bearing for the balance shaft, and you can see all this metal up here is bent. Just the shape of this bearing is really quite spectacular compared to what it's supposed to be. There is a chunk there out of the cylinder wall, there's a chunk there but it's not actually gone through, and the amount of stress, the amount of force you need to create this much damage is pretty spectacular. This half of the con rod is actually wedged solid into the bottom bit of the crankcase, and so that's obviously another bit that's showing how much effort was put into this. And so I suppose what we ought to do really is have a quick word on why this happened. So what happens to put the amount of energy into an engine failure that a balance shaft bends like that rod bolts are literally snapped in half and bits of conrod and engine are absolutely destructed? Well, luckily we have data logging on our sport bike. So throughout free practice and qualifying, our excitable young racer was doing really very respectable lap times. And that meant the gearing was correct for the lap times he was doing. Then, in the race, he managed to find 3/4 of a second more pace, which is excellent and should be commended that he's managed to go that much faster. The only problem then is, because he was going faster, including faster down the straights, the gearing's a bit short. And lap on lap, especially into Paddock Hill Bend, on the down changes, the bike would actually run onto the limiter on the way in towards Paddock Hill Bend, because he's going that much faster down the straight. And then our excitable young racer hooks a couple of gears back, which mechanically over revs the engine. Added to that, you're turning into Paddock Hill Bend at the same time, and so the RPM is going up because you're going onto the smaller side of the tyre. And lap on lap, when we looked at the data, the bike went more and more over the rev limit. And so what I would have hoped the rider would have done at this stage was realise that his gear pattern needed modifying and would start using different gears in different places. Unfortunately, he hadn't got to that point yet, and so he over-revved the engine quite a lot. The lap before this failure into Paddock Hill Bend, we saw 12,146 RPM on the data. And bearing in mind that the rev limiter is at 11,300, that is significant. Also, the rev limiter on the Mectronic ECU that we have to use, the rev limiter is not particularly kind. It's just on or off, and it's, you know, akin to getting a hammer to your pistons and your crank, and it's not very kind. So when you sit the bike on the limiter, it's really quite aggressive on the bottom end of the bike. And so a combination of mechanically over-revving the bike and putting that much more stress on the components than they were designed to take, and the rev limiter not being like a nice soft limiter where it just closes the throttles, it just literally cuts the spark and then adds it back in, so it goes bang, bang, bang. The combination of the two meant that this engine was basically taken way beyond what it was ever designed to do, and that has resulted in this. So we might recover the cylinder head out of it, we might recover a gearbox, some side covers, and a clutch. But this has been an expensive day. So I'm going to go and see if I can find a bank that needs robbing. Thank you for watching. Join us again next time for some more motorbike fun.